thank you for inviting me, thank you for having me, that's really great, it's lovely to be here. I need to confess, I work for TearFund sort of part-time in some sense. What I do for TearFund is purely voluntary, and I do it because of two things really. First off, I think TearFund is a great organisation. There's so many things on television about where you can give to, but I think TearFund is a place you can genuinely give to. And the second reason I do it is because now I'm a Baptist minister and I work in a fairly leafy suburb in Sutton Coldfield with a church with an ageing congregation. We've got one poor person in our church. You know, I say that in honesty. This person was living on the streets and we've helped that. But prior to that, I worked as a missionary for 12 years in Brazil. And it meant that when I went to the supermarket, you know, we would go to the local Carrefour that was there, and we'd have to drive through the middle of a slum. Yeah. And there is something incredibly humbling about doing your weekly shop when you drive back with your food and you see people in the midst of poverty. So I'm incredibly passionate about that. I think we've got a PowerPoint presentation if it ever gets around to working. It could be a bit of fun because, yeah, great. Do you want to knock it on to the next slide? So that's part of the reason I'm passionate about TearFund. It's part of the reason I'm actually passionate about poverty. I was told by TearFund that you have twinned your toilet. Is that correct?
Twinned our toilet?
You don't know anything about that?
No.
Then TearFund have got it wrong. Good. That's a good starting point, isn't it? TearFund runs a programme. Let me start with this. TearFund runs a programme where you can twin your toilet with another toilet somewhere else in the world. It's an amazing idea. And the idea basically is that you would pay something like £60, and that £60 will be used to twin your toilet with another toilet in the world, or better still, to build a toilet and put in sanitation for somebody else. The amazing thing about that is simply this. For the £60 you get, for every one of those £60, it will transfer into £5.50 in terms of improved healthcare, in terms of improved health. And they will tell you the GPS coordinates of the other toilet, so you can hang that on that toilet. We laugh about it and we joke about it, and it's funny, isn't it? I could twin my toilet with something else. But when you think about it, to live a life where you don't have sanitation, where you don't have clean water, is just amazing. So TearFund are involved in that. You may have heard of the East Africa appeal. There is something like 60 million people currently on the brink of starvation in East Africa. I mean, it's an appalling situation. Do you want to go one more? There is, yeah, go on another one as well, if you don't mind. There is 800,000 children in a desperate situation. When you think about somewhere like southern Sudan, keep up on the thing here, I was expecting to be able to move the PowerPoint forward. 4.9 million people needing food assistance. That's an incredible number of people, isn't it? Expected to rise to 5.5 million people on the brink of starvation by the end of July. Go one more. Ethiopia, 5.6 million people. A quarter of all the districts in Ethiopia are now in a state of abject poverty, where people are literally starving to death as we sit here on a Sunday morning. One more. Somalia, 6.2 million people facing food shortages. It's now reached the point where they're having to drive water in because the drought is so bad. These are huge numbers, aren't they? We can't even comprehend them. Go another one. Kenya, 2.7 million people. It's now risen to around 4 million people since this presentation was done. Desperate situation. They've been in effect because their crops have failed, they haven't had rain, all the classic things you hear in the midst of conflict and war. It's a desperate situation. TearFund are working in places like that. Do you want to go one more? TearFund are working in places like that, but they're also working in many other places across the globe. They're working with the Syrian refugee crisis as another example. They're working in Guatemala. They work in South America, they work in Africa, they work wherever poverty exists. And I think having seen poverty firsthand, that touches your heart sometimes, doesn't it? Just to think of the suffering. I know you're from South Africa, I guess you've seen the townships in South Africa, and there is something fundamentally wrong with that. If you want to know more about the work of TearFund, on the table over there are some of these things called Tear Times. TearFund stands for the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund, if you wanted to know what the name stood for. So started by the Evangelical Alliance, I understand it, and they are doing amazing work. There's loads more stuff here about what they're doing. I believe in two things. I believe in the power of prayer, And I believe in the power of action. I'm guessing that's what this church believes in as well. And there's a prayer diary inside of it if you want to pray for things that are going on in the world, if you want to pray for TearFund, if you want to join with other people at the same time and actually pray that God will intervene in this desperate situation. I can't begin to imagine what 16 million people looks like. And I think in my heart, I shouldn't be able to sleep tonight while 16 million people are starving, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? If you wanted two biblical passages to sort of bookend this talk, to act as fundamental blocks for where we're going this morning, there will be one from the New Testament and one from the Old Testament. The New Testament will be a very well-known verse from Mark chapter 12, verses 30 and 31, where it says this. They've asked Jesus, what they must do, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second commandment is this, love your neighbour as yourself. That's quite a fundamental thing for us, isn't it? The second most important thing after our relationship with God is our relationship with other people. It's about how we love the other people that are around us.
Amen.
The second text, which is a text I think has marked my own life, comes from Jeremiah 22, verse 16. It says this, he defended the cause of the poor and the needy, and so all went well with him. Is that not what it means to know me, declares the Lord? And when we talk about the biblical concept of knowing, what we're meaning here is about having a relationship with God. God tells us to do two things. Love God, love your neighbour, and he tells us in Jeremiah that the two things are locked together in terms of our relationship with him. How we care for other people affects our relationship with God. I think by nature I'm not a childy type of people. I'm not the sort of person who wants to run around and pick up kids. But when my own daughter was born, it marked a sort of fundamental turning point in my life. We were living in central Brazil at the time. I'm going to go another slide. Go one more, if you don't mind. We were living in central Brazil at the time, in a relatively poor area. And one of the big quirks for me, because I'm not Brazilian, I'm English, my wife's Brazilian, was you get to choose the doctor that's going to deliver your child. So months beforehand you would start to meet with this person, they don't have midwives, and you build a relationship, and that was lovely. The second thing that was more problematic was this, you get to choose the hospital as well. And we looked around the local hospitals and we had two choices. The one choice had an ITU unit that the hospital was pulling. It was everything you could imagine of a third world hospital. The sort of bed frames are rusty. I'd been admitted there once myself, and you wonder what you're going to catch in it. It was called the Evangelical Hospital. And you thought, that's because you need faith in God, you've got to come out of here. The bed frames were kind of like rusty, the sheets were dirty. You weren't really quite sure what the needles were like in the place. In fact, I went for a HIV test after I'd been in hospital. It kind of tells you the place. The other option was slightly better. Wasn't a lot better, but at least it was a bit cleaner. It was still sort of unair conditioned, so it'd be well over 35 degrees in most of the rooms, mosquitoes in the place. Not the ideal place for your child to go in the world. And we just knew in that moment, if anything went wrong, we'd have to bundle our daughter into the car, or our newborn baby in the car with my wife, and drive them across hospital to the other place. And that was kind of a big stress for us. And as we were sort of thinking about that, like anything happens, the men get worried, don't we? So we pack a little case and we're all prepared for the day the child's going to be born. And my wife got up one morning and she said, I'm going to have the baby today. And like a good man, I went into panic at that moment. Threw the case in the car and she said, not now, today. And then she wanted to go and have a cup of tea with a friend of ours. So we did that, and I sat there and I sweated while she was doing that. And eventually she got in the car and we were driving there and she said, it's lunchtime and these things can take a while. Do you think we should get some lunch on the way to the hospital? And I just went into one of those panics that only blokes could go into. And I negotiated down. In town, believe it or not, there was a McDonald's. So I said, why don't we go to the drive-through? Because I figured it was wrong to have a woman having contractions whilst other people having lunch. And as we got to the drive-thru, one thing I hadn't planned on, they put a number on top of our car and said, go and park and wait. And that's not a good thing when your wife's in labour. But to cut a long story short, they delivered our food, we drove to the hospital, we never got to eat the food, it sat in a car in over 40 degrees of heat, it was horrific by the time I got back to it. But my daughter was born. Go another slide, please. And after my daughter was born, what I did was I went and registered her. And in that moment of registering my daughter, she was put in front of millions of people in the world. She had a nationality, she had a possibility, she had a status, she had a right. Took her home the next day. I sat down at the computer, I did some more paperwork, and I filled in some stuff. I did an internet bank transfer, and my daughter became British. A few weeks later, the birth certificates arrived. She now stood in front of most of the world's population by having 2 nationalities. My wife's Brazilian, but originally her family from Italy. We did some more paperwork. And as we moved forward from there, she suddenly got another nationality. She became Italian as well. So my daughter now has 3 nationalities. My wife has 2 nationalities. I'm in the process of collecting a couple to go with it. I feel like a criminal when I go through passport control, because we hold 8 or 9 passports between us at the moment, and the number's sort of increasing. But what it told me is she is actually in front of the vast majority of the world. My daughter is a child of the planet. As countries go up and down, she can move where she wants. If Brexit is a disaster, she can move to Italy. Part of our coming back from Brazil is Brazil's become incredibly violent at the moment. She's a child. Now for most of us that doesn't really matter, does it? Because most of us were born in this country. And I don't think we sometimes realise the privilege of that, and I include myself in this. Do you want to go another slide? You know, often in this world we think that I work hard and I have earned it. I work hard and I deserve it. I'm privileged enough to own a house, which is a privilege nowadays. But part of me thinks I did overtime, because I used to work in the electronics industry many years ago. I did overtime, I worked weekends, I raised a deposit, I managed to buy it like I did this, God. I did a first degree in theology many years back. And I feel like I worked hard, I put the effort in. But actually a church funded that. Later on I was privileged enough to do a master's in theology, and I've just completed a postgraduate in development studies. And I like to think often that that's because I did it. But what I forget is actually where I'm born, where I grow up, will affect the whole of my life. It will affect the choices that I have. Sorry, go one more. It will affect the choices that I have. If I am born in England, I have possibilities. If I'm born in other places, sometimes I don't have any possibilities at all. That's the reality of it, isn't it? Where you are born will affect how you will live, and even how you will die and how long you will live. The very fact that we have a house over our head, the very fact that we go to school, the very fact that we have something to eat every day, the very fact that we live in relative safety in this country, and having lived in a country with no safety at all, you realise what a privilege it is to drive home at night and not have to look up and down the road to see if there's another car in the road. Is that person going to rob me? The very fact that we have a relatively functioning health service, though we moan about it, puts us in front of the rest of the world. I know our health service has many problems. But I drove a guy to hospital in Brazil, screaming in agony in the back of the car. We carried him into the hospital. And the first question was, who's going to pay for this? We live in an incredibly privileged situation. Do you want to go one more? I don't think I need to say this, but more than half the world's population are currently living on less than $2.50 a day. That fact has bothered me for a long time. But it bothers me more now because I've discovered that it's $2.50 in terms of what you can buy with $2.50 in the United States, not what you can buy for $2.50 in Africa. Or put another way, it's like us trying to live on about £2.50 a day here for your health, your education, your schooling, your food, your accommodation, everything. Half the world's population is currently living like that. 1.3 billion people are living on less than $1.25 a day. And can you imagine what it must be like to live on £1.25 a day for everything here? and for the entirety of your life, not in a momentary blip. 1 billion children living in poverty, 22,000 children will die today. That's the appalling statistic of the world that we live in, the world that God created. I'm not suggesting he created poverty, but he created this planet. And now 22,000 children are dying a day. 805 million people going hungry as we go home for our Sunday lunches. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, but it should reflect on our lives, shouldn't it? What privileged position we start from. 2,300 people will die today of crazy things like diarrhea or other diseases that we could cure easily. I mean, something is fundamentally wrong. And I don't think that's the way that God wants the world. I just can't believe that 65 million children won't reach the height that they should reach because they don't have enough nutrition. I can't believe that God wants a world in which children won't have the mental development they should have because they don't have the nutrition they should have when they're a child. I just can't believe that that's the way the world should be. Where we are born, it takes so much about everything. And it just seems to me, as I look at it, as I look at the world, there's this increasing thing on the political side of putting up walls, of putting up boundaries, of stopping poor people moving from one area to another. That just seems to be the way the world's going, isn't it? As we talk about Brexit, we're worried about our health service, but we'll still let in the good people, the people we want. Now, I'm not stupid enough to assume that everybody can move to this part of the world, but I think God wants us to do something. Something needs fundamentally readdressing. But when I look through the Bible, I don't think that it's hit God by surprise, the situation we've got. If we were to look at archaeological evidence from 10 centuries before Christ, what we would find among the Jewish communities at the time, among God's people, is simply this. They lived in houses of roughly the same size. Excuse me. They lived in houses of the same size, with the same things inside of them, the same sort of utensils, the same sort of furniture from what we can tell. They lived in relative equality 10 centuries before Christ. 200 years later, 8 centuries before Christ, when they do excavation now, what they find is that the social classes have developed. There are richer, bigger houses in some areas, and there are people living in abject poverty in other areas among God's people. Something has changed. And we know that it changes at one point in the Bible. There are lots of reasons for the changes, but we know one of the fundamental things. If you work through the book of Judges, you will find there is a phrase that is repeated in the book of Judges. And Israel wanted a king. That's the way the book of Judges is going. God raises up these people, and Israel wanted a king. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God tells them the consequences of having a king. He says, if you have a king, he will take the best of your land, he will take the best of your crops, he will take the best of your animals. He will make some of your sons and daughters work for him. He'll make them run before his chariot. He'll make them serve in your army. He'll make them wait on your tables. Just what's happening. God says, if you have a king, if you have a political system that matches the rest of the world, you will move from equality to a system where some people have everything and other people have less or nothing. That seems to be the way that God says this, but despite all of that, it doesn't seem that's the way that God wants it. If we had a whole day, we could look at the whole Bible. We could start in Genesis, in chapters 1 to 3, in that perfect bit of the world. We could say there is no person in need or necessity at that time. There's no poverty or hunger or need or necessity in Genesis 1 and 3. When we talk about the other end of the Bible, what do we find? Our prayer, our hope, our passion, our desire is, when we get to heaven, there's going to be no need, no want, no hunger, no thirst, no suffering. That seems to be God's model. In the wilderness, in the middle, God displays in one sense what he expects of his people, because nobody gets too far ahead and nobody falls too far ahead. Deuteronomy 8:4 tells us that their clothes don't wear out. Every day food is supplied to them in the quantity that they need. Nehemiah 9:21 tells us that they lack nothing in that time. It seems to be God's plan that somehow there would be points of redress in this world, that somehow we would look after each other, loving God and loving our neighbour. That seems to be the way that God wants things to work out. But even when they move from this system of living in a desert to living in a system where some people could get ahead and some people could get behind in the promised land, God builds in a whole structure throughout the Bible to try and prevent poverty from happening. I don't know if you've noticed that. There are 3 fundamental verses in Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 15:4. However, there need be no poor among you, for the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless. God says there is enough for all of us. I don't know how you think about world population. If you look at the UNDP, United Nations World site, they reckon it will peak at something like 13.2 billion people on the planet. If you look at the work of someone like Hans Rosling, great guy who brings statistics into an understandable way, he puts the figure at about 9.1, 9.2 billion. We know that the planet's population is going to stabilise. We're sure of that because the birth rate's already stabilised. It's just a question of things catching up. And we know that there's enough for all of those people. The only problem is we need to share it around a bit more.
That's right.
That's the fundamental. There isn't enough if everybody wants to live like the developed world. There's enough if we live at a slightly more humble level. Is that not something of what God calls us to do? But God seems to know that having stated the ideal there'll be no poor among you, he seems to raise the possibility. Just a couple of verses later, Deuteronomy 15, 17, 7 and 8. If there's anyone poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather be open-handed and freely lend to them whatever they need. Having stated the ideal, God says, if this is what I want you to do. If this is what I want to do. But it's like God knows me better than I know myself. And this is a reflection on my own daughter. Sometimes I say if, but the next thing I do is I give her a command of what she must do, because I know her, and God does that. Deuteronomy 15:11. There will always be poor among you in the land. Therefore I command you, be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. God states the ideal, the possibility, and then the reality, and he just tells us what we need to do in reflection of that. There is a command for us to be open-handed, whether that be in the third world or here in our local town. One of the things that bothers me as an individual, I think, considerably, is simply this. When I go to a Christian bookshop, there are hundreds of books on improving my spirituality, and that's not a bad thing. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body and soul. There are lots of books related to that. How few books there are on loving my neighbour as myself.
Amen. Yeah.
Have you not noticed that in the bookshops? It's all about me and my relationship to God, and there's very little about me and my relationship to my fellow man. Yet Jeremiah tells us that our relationship to our fellow man is influenced, our relationship to God is influenced by our relationship to our fellow man. In other words, we are actually missing out when we don't relate to other people. It's funny, especially when you think that the strongest theme in the Bible is clearly salvation, but after that, the theme of poverty and how God feels about it has got to be one of the strongest themes that comes out of Scripture. Yet so often we don't see that, do we? Certainly not in the Christian bookshop, certainly not in a lot of our churches, certainly not in our own lives often. And that's a reflection on my own life as well. I was thinking about my prayer life, and it just made me realise how often I want God to do something for me. Father, I'm ill. Could you heal me? Father, I'm unemployed. Could you give me work? Father, I don't know what's going to happen because X or Y happened to our car. How are we going to pay for that? And what I realise in the prayers, so often I'm asking God to do something in the present. I'm not just saying, God, will you save somebody? Often my prayer life revolves around the present reality in which I live, because I want to worship God, but I also want things in this life at this moment now. And as I think about my prayer life, the thing that strikes me is how often my prayer life actually involves somebody else doing something for me. Father, I'm unemployed. Find some other person who will give me a job. Father, I cannot pay this bill. May you raise up somebody that will give me a gift I wasn't expecting. I mean, it happens from time to time, doesn't it? I was working as a missionary, and I came back to this country. We didn't have a huge amount of money. Some family have generously supported us over £100 a month for the last 8-9 years, and they asked me to do something for them. And it took me about 5 minutes to work on the house, and the lady said, my husband said I need to pay you, and I turned it down 3 times. I said, no, it's fine, you've supported us, I'm pleased. It's taken me longer to drink the coffee than it has to sort the problem out in the house. And she gave me an envelope, and like all good Christians, I put it in my pocket without looking. I don't know if that's your own experience, you don't want to see what's in it. And I went to another shop, and when I got to the shop, like all good Christians, I opened it up, and inside was a cheque for £2,000. Yeah, often when we have problems or difficulties in our lives, we say, Lord, how am I going to support myself? How am I going to pay for my family? And that involves other people helping us. Actually, the answer to prayer, sometimes it's spiritual, but often it's also actually other people, isn't it? That's about loving our neighbours, about us being open to hear God. I find it interesting when I read through the Bible just how much God builds in this idea of helping your neighbour, this idea of resolving the problem of poverty. When you think of Scripture, the most important thing you could have is land. If you didn't have land, you didn't have a life. They were sort of an agricultural community. You needed to grow things. You could read the book of Ruth, just 4 chapters when you get home, and it will tell you all about the problems of not having land, the problems of drought, the problems of difficulty. But in that book, you'll also find what God puts in place to try and resolve the issue. But even before that, in the Levitical law, he said every 50 years there will be a year of Jubilee. Isn't it funny that we've never practiced that? What was the principle of that was? It was, well, some people will get ahead, but every 50 years we are going to try and redress the balance so that people don't get too far ahead and so that people don't fall so far behind. You could think about other texts in the Bible. You could think about stuff where it talks about cancellation of debts. Again, in Deuteronomy 15, it says every 7 years you're going to cancel the debts. Now, wouldn't that feel great? Because every 7 years your debts were written off. And we're appalled when we turn on the television and they talk about, get this credit card, get this loan, and the interest rate is 1,000% or something like that. Yet most of the people in the developing world are crippled by the debts of previous generations. Something needs to change, something needs to be done with it. The worst situation you could get, and some of the people who are essentially in this situation, is you will become a slave. You have sold your land, you have lost your home, you have lost your income, you become a slave. And we see that in today's world, don't we? People in some of these starving countries are involved in prostitution, they're involved in a whole host of things, simply because they have no other possibility. What would I do for my daughter? I'd do anything for my daughter. That's the situation, and God says, I want to release people from slavery. I want to release people from poverty. That's the God we serve. When you look at the book of Proverbs, of all the Proverbs that talk about poverty, and some of them do say that poor people are lazy people. I mean, there's no getting around that. Some people are poor because they are lazy. But 2/3 of the Proverbs blame socioeconomic injustice as the cause of poverty. That's what the Bible tells us. Proverbs 21:30. Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. What does God say to us when we don't meet the need of our brother or sister sitting next to us in this church? What is God saying to us when we don't meet the needs of those on the other side of the planet? You can't get over the fact that God's interested in poverty. If we had time, we could look at Matthew 25:31-46, a text that as evangelical Christians, a text as Protestant Christians, we find so difficult, when God says that somehow our judgment will be linked to what we have done for other people. And we don't like the idea of salvation by works, but what I think it is saying, if you know God, something in your heart will see the world the way God sees it. If you follow God, something inside of you will do the things that God wants you to do. And that will be supporting your neighbours and supporting other people. He defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well with him. Is that not what it means to know me, declares the Lord? It's not a text we like to read often sometimes. There is something about our Christianity, our concern and our generosity that are all linked together. And as I look, for 12 years I taught church history. It's a bit of a dead subject. The students weren't most excited coming into the church history lessons, you can imagine, can't you? And they would study in the evening, so we'd have to teach church history till 11 o'clock at night. But what struck me teaching church history was simply this. In every generation, the church has picked up the torch and has helped the poor and the needy. Almost without exception. The early church, you'd start off at the day of Pentecost when you teach church history, when the church is sort of formed and the Holy Spirit comes. And within a short space of time, the church in Jerusalem is caring for more than 500 widows and orphans. And the number is growing, and they don't have a huge number of resources. But what happens is the non-Christian Roman emperor complains about the church because it says it's not looking after just their own poor, it's now looking after our poor as well. Wouldn't that be a complaint that we would like in our lives?
Yeah.
That we care not only for our own, but we care for others. I'm sure you do lots of it in this church already. One of my favourite characters from church history, John Wesley. Incredible preacher, preached to 20,000 people at one point, preached to 10,000 at another, had an incredible ministry of coming to faith, and yet he always cared for the poor throughout his life. There's a man that said, if I die with £10 in my bank, I have robbed somebody. He died with £8 in his bank. There's a man that says, when I die, I don't want my family to carry my coffin. Find 6 unemployed men and pay them to carry my coffin. There's a man who said, at those days you would drape the curtain, the windows of the church with black cloth when somebody died. And he said, when I die, you drape it with the best cloth, and afterwards you take it down and you make dresses for poor women out of it. That's John Wesley. We could talk about Hannah More, who said, if you're not educated, you will never get on in life. Therefore, she opened up a lot of possibilities for education for the poor people. Christians have always been involved in it. William Wilberforce, another great example, he said it is wrong that people live in physical slavery, and it's wrong that people live in the slavery of poverty, and worked his life to try and resolve the issues. Never quite saw the complete abolition. He died just before it. What a great testimony. William Booth, the Salvation Army, actually not William Booth, his wife, because behind every good man there's a good woman. He realised that you cannot preach the gospel to people whilst they are starving. And she said, William, feed the people, not just spiritually but physically, and they will come to Christ. There is something about it in the whole of Christian history that God wants us to care for the poor. I lived in Brazil for 12 years. I don't know where we will live in the future. Perhaps we'll move back there, perhaps we'll move somewhere else. I don't know, but Brazil taught me a few things about poverty. And the first one was really this: the scale of the suffering that people go through. I don't know about you, but I've had 2 major moments of crisis in my own personal life. The first one, my wife had an operation in Brazil. Like here, they kick you out of hospital quite quickly. And she'd had a shower, and I went into the living room and she was unconscious on the living room floor. Basically, she had collapsed and swallowed her tongue. And in those moments of panic, whilst you're forcing someone's mouth open and putting your hand down their throat and you retrieve their tongue and they start to breathe again, you just realise what it is to be stressed about the life of another person. Funnily enough, she came round and then was sick all over the floor and said, I can't understand why I've done that. I thought, well, if you'd known how far I put my fingers down your throat, you'd probably understand. The second moment of crisis in my life was probably equally bad. We drove to my mother-in-law's house. It used to take us 13 hours on the second day to get there. We lived in central Brazil, we would drive to the south. We were tired, we had been driving for 2 days. we pulled into the mother-in-law's, we met in the middle of an armed robbery. My wife was out the car, I was still in the car, they got me out the car, and my daughter was on the back seat of the car. And it's an interesting experience when you realise that you love somebody enough that you'll call the bluff of somebody with a gun against your head to retrieve your daughter. Messy situation. Taking a child out of a seat without taking their seatbelt off, holding them, hoping they won't be shot. But what they made me realise was this: the 2 moments of stress in my life have been momentary. 5, 6, 10 minutes later, you're thinking, gosh, God, I'm so thankful that you have done that. I wonder what it is like when you see your child dying and there is nothing you can do. I wonder what it's like when you see your husband or wife or boyfriend or sister or brother starving and there is nothing you can do. I can only imagine it takes what I've been through a couple of points in my life and scales it up. And how much worse must it feel when you realise actually this is not an incurable disease, this is something that could be resolved if somebody was just a little more generous. The second thing it taught me, seeing poverty face to face, was this: every poor person is a real person.
Yes.
I have seen the inside of slums where children have died, and it's just appalling. And you realise every one of those 22,000 children that will die today has or had a family. Everyone will be cried over, and God will cry over every one of them. Sometimes I can turn off the television and somebody said to me, to live in Brazil you need to be blind in one eye, and I understand what they mean. You need to keep an eye on where you're going and not look at anything else. But for the people who suffer, they can't do that, and they're real people. Often as well, I think we feel like we can't do anything. I'm just a drop in the ocean. What can I do? I'm a Baptist minister. I live in the first world. There are 3 billion people living in poverty. What Brazil taught me as an individual is I am just going to do a drop in the ocean. The best I will ever do is affect the lives of a few people, but I've met the people whose lives I've affected. And they will never forget what you do for them, even if they don't know your name. The Bible says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body and soul. Love them with your strength, but it tells us to love our neighbours as ourselves. I wonder what loving our neighbours as ourselves actually means. I guess if I think about the local context here, perhaps it is what we're talking about this morning, sharing our faith with other people. What does it mean for the third world? Well, the easiest way I get to understand that is to say, if I was in a desperate position, what would I think loving me meant? If I was starving, what would somebody showing expression of love to me be? It would be somebody meeting my need at the point where I had it. That's what I think God means when he says, love your neighbour as yourself. Look at that need. Is it spiritual? Is it physical? How can I meet it? I'm always fascinated by the book of Acts and by Corinthians. And Paul raises a collection in the Gentile churches for the Church of Jerusalem. They were in a fairly difficult situation. But what he's saying is, I'm going to take one people group that are detached from another people group, and I'm going to ask them if they can do something to resolve the problem. Now, Paul could have said, I've got a great ministry going on. People are coming to church. People are coming to faith. New churches are being planted. I'm doing so much. But he said, in the midst of all that, I'm going to ask people to give to those that don't. Because that's the model of Christianity that I think we have. A God who cares, not just for me, but a God who cares for everybody created in his image. In the Bible, there is little emphasis on us expecting the state to do something for somebody else. There is a massive emphasis on God expecting us to do something for somebody else. I look at the gleaning rites that you find in the book of Ruth, for example, and they just fascinate me. If you go over your fields the first time, and anything falls to the ground, you were not allowed to pick it up. You would have to leave it for the poor. If you missed something, you couldn't go back and pick it up. And if you left, you had to leave an area all round the side. A percentage of your wealth, your work, would go to care for those that were in need. That's the reality of the Old Testament. We talk a lot about tithing in churches. I don't know if you talk about it in this church. We don't like to talk about money much in England, do we? We have subtle ways of implying it. Lord, I need a new car. From a wealthy person in the church. But what's fascinating about tithing is, it says that 10% will be given to the Levites. The Levites had no other form of income. They would have starved if they hadn't received that. But there is another text in the Bible that talks about tithing. It says for 2 years have a party with it, but in the third year you will save the entirety of it to care for the Levites, the poor, the widows, and the foreigners. In other words, those in society that have no other means of income. That would be 1/3 of the church's income. There's an incredible responsibility for us. Do you mind going forward a few slides? Keep going. Brilliant. No, go back one. I think there is a biblical mandate for us to help other people. I certainly know there are other people that need help. We started by talking about TearFund, and I recognise that time is moving on. We're going to end by talking about TearFund again. As I said, I don't actually work for TearFund. What you choose to do in relation to TearFund doesn't affect me in the slightest. I'm not dependent on TearFund for a salary or anything. It's simply that I think they're a good organisation. I think there's a biblical mandate to help the poor. I think there's an awful lot of poor people. 16 million people starving to death, but they're not the only ones. There's a place called Chad in Central Africa. It's had droughts since the 1980s. It's had 2 or 3 years of horrific droughts, and that's caused a massive problem for people. Shall I go on another one? It's inherently a dry land anyway, with sort of very sort of small rivers or streams at best. It's what we would call sertão in Brazil. It's sort of that dry, arid, sort of almost desert-like, but with bits growing in the middle of it. There are some rivers. Do you want to do one more? There are some rivers. They used to be big, but now they have reduced in size because of the drought. Got another one. They've reached the point where you can now stand up to your ankles to get water. That's causing a massive problem for something like 5.9 million people. That's a lot of people, isn't it? Something like 20% of the children won't reach 5 years of age. They'll have died before they get there. If one child dies in our church, we are devastated. Can you imagine if you're talking about 20% of your children? It's affecting children like Yasmin. She's a classic example. She's 6. She's Muslim. She's 6 years old. She's one of 4. She'd hoped to go to school. The 2 years of drought have meant that the crops have failed. She's now got no possibility of going to school. What's in the bowl in front of her is what she would eat for the day. It's a fairly horrific situation. It's been caused by rain coming late. It's been caused by high temperatures. It's been caused by the fact that they can only have 1 crop per year. It's been caused because the crops have failed. The lady in the picture is saying how high the crop should be at this time of year. You can see in front of her the actual reality of the situation, what they're facing. And then there's nothing till next year, obviously, in the current situation. This is her family. In front of them is what they will eat per day without help. I mean, it's a pretty dire situation. They've reached a point now where one of the things they are doing to try and support themselves is they dig through ants' nests to look for the seeds to try and find things they can plant for next year or things they can eat for today. As a group of people, they are not lazy. Yasmin's family, I'm not really into visuals in presentations. I never use them in my own church, but Yasmin's family have taken up basket weaving. But what they can produce in 5 days provides for 2 meals. It's not a good means of income. Clearly something needs to be done. TearFund's been hugely involved in this. They have teamed up with a local church and they are putting in emergency aid to try and help the people. What I find interesting is the people they are helping are Muslims and they can't believe that the Christian church would help them. I mean, that's just incredible, isn't it? If you want to preach the gospel, this is one of the ways of doing it, isn't it? I have no good reason for doing this, but they're going to help you anyway, even though you have another faith. They teamed up with them. They're now helping them to to eat better. This would now be their daily income. That has come about because of people like you. TearFund does not have money. It only has money because people of God give to it as an organisation. That's the bottom line. Without people like you and people in other churches, there would be no possibility. So now they're helping people using the local church so they can actually survive. But that's not a long-term possibility, is it? What they've also done is they said that people need to work, so they are swapping work for food. And as part of that process, they're now trying to build dams and they are flooding 72 hectares. What will that mean? It will mean that the people are no longer dependent on one crop per year. They will now have a water supply that will allow them to grow more per year. It also means they'll be able to plant crops in areas where they will grow well, and in some of them they can transplant to other areas afterwards. It's giving them a long-term future. Shall we go another one? So I guess when I think about the biblical perspective on poverty, there is something that says that we have a responsibility if we have. And there may be people here that don't have any possibility at all. I don't know. There may be people that need to receive. I don't know. But how much does it actually take to transform a desperate situation like this girl into a happy young girl with a long-term future where she might be able to grow crops, where there may be a possibility of school, where her family aren't going to be at the point of starvation? The reality is it actually costs something like 33 pence a day per person. That's not much, is it? So let me leave you with this. And I'm not trying to put pressure on anyone at all. You know, we do what we do before God. All of us have our own situations. Some of us may have given massively generously to things in the past. Some of us may be supporting people here. But let me leave you with this. Is there something you could do to transform the life of another person? You know, are we generous enough, is the question that comes out of life for me, to actually save the lives of other people? That's what it comes down to, isn't it? Is there something you could do? TearFund as an organisation needs people who will support it. It's wonderful if people give one-off gifts, but those are usually quite difficult. They're difficult for two reasons. They're difficult because it puts a huge strain on people to give a large quantity of money. They are difficult because TearFund can't administer that well. Who will give what? What TearFund would like people to do is to think if they would be prepared to commit to giving a small amount on a monthly basis. And it doesn't matter how small that is. You know, if you were to give £1 a month, you would provide several meals for a family during a month. If you give £2 a month, that would be better. If you give £5 a month, we're not talking about people who need to give hundreds. So on behalf of TearFund, if you could help, if you could transform the lives of the poor, if you could live up to a biblical expectation, there's a possibility. On the table over there is more information about TearFund. There are prayer diaries inside of the TearFund information, smaller cards to the side, if you would be interested, if you'd be interested in helping people like Yasmin to actually have the possibility of a future. There's a bit inside, it says, you know, I could pay monthly this amount or that amount. You can put any amount, no amount's too small. I'm just going to ask if you prayerfully consider that. Please don't give out of a sense of guilt, don't give out of a sense of I ought to do this or other people think this. Just leave it to God. If God touches your heart, great, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. If God's telling you to do something different, that's also fine. But whatever we do, whether we do it through TearFund or something else, there is something inherently linked with our Christian faith and helping our brother who has a need, whether that brother's close to us or across the other side of the world. Thank you for your time, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. It's been lovely to see your church. It's great to see what God is doing here. In the thing before the service, we prayed about building, and my prayer will be that this place will grow. You've got an amazing start. I was just listening to your worship, it's wonderful. My prayer will be that you will grow and grow and grow. Amen. And that you will reach this city and that you will reach this town here. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.